Well, hello, and welcome to the first Tourism Workforce Summit. We're thrilled to have you all here with us for a full day of networking and learning about fundamental topics in tourism workforce development, including hiring, training, and retention. My name is Tony Cameron. I'm the CEO of the Maine Tourism Association. And before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors who, without this day, we wouldn't be able to make it possible. So, Awesome. So first off, I'd like to thank the Maine Office of Tourism, who is our gold sponsor. Please visit their table in the back and check out all the wonderful things that they do. They are great partners of all of us. Also, thank you to 86 & Co., who sponsored our lanyards. You guys all look fantastic wearing them, so good job. And thank you to the Atlantic Baking Company, who provided all the cookies that are on the table, and also the speaker gifts. I can't wait to have them. Cookies are my favorite, so thank you. And also thank you to the Maine Business Education Partnership, who covered over 20 tickets, who sponsored over 20 tickets, so a lot of you could be here today. So thank you to them, and please check out their table in the back as well. At the Maine Tourism Association, we're all about promoting and supporting tourism in our beautiful state, whether it's hotels, restaurants, outdoor recreation, other attractions, and so much more. We're here to ensure Maine remains a top destination for travelers, and we're proud to be able to represent and serve all of you. MTA has many layers, from operating the 7 state visitor centers on behalf of the state, producing the official state publication, cleaning and maintaining the centers to make sure that everyone has a warm, welcoming experience, legislative advocacy, and of course, workforce development. You can find out more about us at our table in the back. And check out all the loads of resources that we have to help support you and make sure that your business thrives. Our mission is to lead the growth and sustainability of Maine's tourism industry. Tourism is a crucial part of Maine's identity, and the people who make it happen are the real heroes. I am so proud of the Workforce Department of MTA and the creation of Tourism for Me, the workforce division of MTA. Catherine Ferentz and Carolyn Rideout have done a tremendous job creating resources, content, and partnerships this past year, and are creating the foundation for a better understanding of all the careers and job opportunities the tourism industry offers. We're here today to chat about how to find and keep the best talent, innovative ways to train and to develop your team, and growing to share our collective wisdom to keep the industry growing. We're all aware of the importance of a skilled and motivated tourism workforce, and today is all about sharing our best practices, challenges, and ideas. I want to say a big thank you to all of you for being here. Your presence shows your dedication to the future of Maine's tourism industry and your commitment to creating an unforgettable experiences for all of our visitors. We, the Maine Tourism Association and Tourism for Me, are here to have your back throughout this journey. Our first presentation of the day comes from Mark McInerney, an economist and the director of Center of Workforce Research and Information at the Maine Department of Labor. CWRI's core mission is to inform the public about conditions and trends in the workforce. Mark joined CWRI in 2020, and after completing his PhD in economics at the University of Connecticut, please join me in welcoming Mark McInerney.
Good morning, everyone. So thanks so much for having me. Again, Mark McInerney. I'm the director of the Center for Workforce Research and Information, and I've prepared a little bit of hopefully helpful information about the state labor market, a little bit of an overview of the whirlwind over the last 4 years or so, the dramatic effect that the pandemic has had on sectors that are related to Maine's tourism economy, the recovery of a lot of that economic activity, and then understanding today, probably a concern that is top of mind for many folks, the workforce constraints and kind of understanding what are the causes of and possible strategies in light of those workforce constraints. So I would encourage you all, my contact information here on the slides, but don't hesitate to reach out if you have any other questions or clarification, any other way that we can help. This first slide looks at the state's labor market in terms of the overall jobs levels in the entire labor market, and then in two sectors that are closely related to Maine's tourism economy. So leisure and hospitality is a sector that includes accommodation, food services, art, entertainment, and recreation. And then the retail trade sector, of course, has a mixture of many retailers that are closely related to or benefiting from the tourism that comes into the state, but of course lots of other retailers that also serve the local population in addition to folks that may be visiting the state. So this particular chart looks at, this is a job index that shows the overall staffing level in 2019. So the job index level of 100 shows you this is what the staffing level was on average in 2019. And then each change in the index represents a % change in the overall staffing in that sector. And so we can see what the effect of the pandemic was on staffing levels across, the entire economy and then these two tourism-related sectors. So overall, if we looked at the Maine's labor market in the dark blue, in the red, we can see there was a very dramatic effect. Nearly 15% of jobs were affected at the onset of the pandemic. And then as we, learned to adapt to the pandemic and we experienced this robust economic recovery, statewide, the jobs levels has recovered, and now there are more jobs than there were on average in 2019, about 1.5% more jobs. But of course, the effect of the pandemic was very different, in particular in tourism-related industries. The effect on the retail trade sector was similar, where there was a dramatic effect at the beginning of the pandemic, and then subsequent recovery, where there are now about 1% more jobs in retail compared to 2019 on average. Slow recovery beyond that jobs level in 2019. But the effect in leisure and hospitality was much, much more severe. It affected nearly half of all jobs in leisure and hospitality. And we can see, just the much deeper effect early on in the pandemic, affecting leisure and hospitality in the green series, and a really robust economic recovery. But today, the staffing level overall in Maine's leisure and hospitality sector is lower, about 5% lower than in 2019. And, in parallel with those widespread job losses, of course, the state's unemployment rate surged in the spring of 2020. And throughout that period of economic recovery, unemployment has slowly ticked down to the point now where unemployment is, in the state of Maine, near all-time record lows. Unemployment is below 3%, which, statewide across all industries would suggest that there is a very competitive environment for labor. The vast majority of job seekers, folks that are in the workforce, are employed, and so it's a very, very competitive hiring environment now where overwhelmingly the folks that are in the state workforce have a job, very, very low unemployment environment. At the same time, we've seen some dramatic changes in the state's population. So in particular, the effect of the pandemic has decoupled place of work with your choice of residence for many folks that have remote work opportunities. And that, along with some other factors, led to this surge in migration, folks that were relocating to the state of Maine following the pandemic. In particular, 2021 saw the highest rate of net migration into Maine in any year since 1950. And that trend continued in 2022, but it started to increase at a slower rate. So through net migration, that is folks moving from other areas into the state of Maine, the population grew by over 21,000 in 2021, and then by an additional 14,000 in 2022. That population growth has been a mixture of folks moving to Maine from other U.S. states. About 88% of the population growth since 2020 has been folks relocating from other states moving to Maine, and about 12% has been international migration. So since 2020, from 2020 to 2022, the state's population increased by about 3,600 for folks relocating to Maine through international migration. And focusing in now on that, the population of international migrants to Maine, the foreign-born population in Maine now makes up about 4% of the state's overall workforce. So that is a relatively small overall share of the workforce, but an increasing share. And this chart kind of shows you of the foreign-born population, the different sectors that folks born outside of the US are working in Maine. And we see a mixture here where, largely this reflects the overall, landscape of employment across industries. But of course, the tourism-related sectors of leisure and hospitality and retail trade represent significant sources of employment for the foreign-born population, about 10% overall of the foreign-born population that are in Maine's workforce today. All right. So, I showed earlier that the state's unemployment rate has been slowly falling since the onset of the pandemic to record low rates that we've never seen before, below 3% unemployment. And to understand the competition for workers in this current environment, I think it's really important to understand the overall demographics, what's shaping the state population, and the population structure, how that's evolved over time. So this chart here takes a look at the state population and combines folks into 3 age cohorts. Looking all the way back to 1950 at each 10-year census, this is a snapshot of the state's population in those 3 age groups, whereas the red shows the share of the state population that are under 25. The green shows the share of the state population that are in what economists call prime working ages, between 25 and 54. Those are the ranges where most folks have gone on to complete their education, and they're participating in the workforce at the highest rates. And then the purple series show the population that are age 55 and over. The population 55 and over, we start to see participation in the workforce tend to lower, and particularly around age 65 where retirement decisions are prevalent, but it could be due to other reasons related to health, disability, caring for a loved one, variety of other factors. We start to see participation in the workforce tend to lower among the population 55 and over. So given that, how has the state's population shifted over time? Corresponding to the baby boom generation, we see this explosion in population, but in young population in particular, in the 1950s and 60s, to where moving up to 1970, now by far the largest cohort in the state of Maine is the under 25. And those folks are just about to enter their prime working ages, right? And fast forward now to the year 2000, that large baby boom generation has advanced into their prime working ages. And now in 2000, the largest cohort are those that are in those prime working ages, 25 to 54. Each generation behind the baby boom generation is subsequently smaller in size because birth rates have been falling over many years. So as we see that advancing age structure, the share of the population that are reaching those prime working ages, the red series, continues to fall over many years. And now, fast forwarding to 2022, the baby boom generation is now advancing into the 55 and over age cohort. That's the largest cohort in terms of the state's overall population. There are now more folks in the 55 and over age cohort than there are folks in the prime working ages 25 to 54. And the smallest demographic group is the under 25 demographic group. Right, so this is really creating some pressure on some constraints on the state's workforce because there are, simply put, more folks that are reaching retirement ages or age ranges where participation in the workforce is less prevalent. There are more folks in the purple demographic group than there are in the red demographic group that are about to enter those prime working ages and participating at the highest rates. So a question that often is raised by industry groups or by policymakers is, why is it the case that labor force participation rates are so much lower in Maine than they are nationally or in other contexts? And it's really because of this. If we look at the distribution of the working age population in Maine, and we compare that to the nation, for example, the working age population demographic on this chart is in the dark blue, and the United States, the distribution of the working age population is in red. Maine, in terms of the population age 16 and over, we have a much lower share of population in that under 35 demographic and the 45 to 54 demographic. And we have a much larger share of population in the 55 and above demographic. And this is, in particular, in the 65 and above, we have a much larger population share in the 65 and above demographic, where the majority of folks are no longer in the workforce. And that's primarily due to retirement. Again, we see a lot of retirement decisions made around the age of 65. So this is a kind of like a bit of a thought experiment, but imagine that our population structure was the same as that of the nation. What if, the age distribution of our population was the same as the nation? But folks in the state of Maine were equally likely in each age group to participate in the workforce as we see in the data. How would we look compared to the nation? Well, there would be really no difference in our labor force participation rate. Our participation rate would be 62.4%, which is just above the nation's 62.2%. The 4 percentage point difference between labor force participation in Maine and the nation is really entirely explained by this, the difference in our age structure relative to the nation. And so, I think that demographic picture is so critical when you think about the balance in the labor market in Maine, or that intense competition for workers that I'm sure many of us are aware of. One way to think about the balance in the labor market between the labor supply and the labor demand, and again, the labor supply comes from folks that are actively in the workforce, looking for employment, or currently employed. And labor demand comes from employers, right? Employers are in a variety of different sectors, and they need labor to deliver goods and services to their customers. So one way to measure labor demand is to look at the state job opening rate. So that is, what share of jobs throughout the state are currently unfilled that employers are actively recruiting and trying to fill that job. That's what the job openings rate measures. And the state's unemployment rate measures, among the folks that are in the workforce, how many are not currently employed, they're unemployed, actively seeking a job. Often in the state's history, and we can see here, I'm going back to the early 2000s, often it's been the case that there has been a high labor supply relative to the labor demand, right? That is, we have relatively more job seekers competing for a relatively scarce number of job openings. But that's begun to flip. And we can see here, leading up to the pandemic and where we are in 2022 and 2023, right, that balance has flipped now because of the state's demographic picture. There are a lot of job openings and a relatively scarce number of job seekers. So we can see, that the balance between those two has begun to flip, and now there is a much higher job opening rate relative to the state's unemployment rate. And for really any scarce resource, when resources are scarce, prices tend to go up. And that's, of course, what we're seeing in the labor market. Labor is relatively scarce. Lots of employers are competing for workers, and that's driving wage growth. So in 2022, compared to the year before, across all industries, wages were up 6.4%. And if we look at the two tourism-related sectors of retail, trade, and leisure and hospitality, we can see that wage growth rates were pretty similar to the growth rates across all industries. Here's a little chart that kind of focuses in, but in a bit more detail here. This table shows a comparison of the average weekly wage in the accommodation, food services sector, arts, entertainment, and recreation, and retail trade, and a comparison to how quickly wages have grown in the last few years since the pandemic. And we have seen that wage growth in accommodation and food service in particular has been among the fastest among any sector in the state. And that was in particular in 2021. So we think back to that picture of economic recovery. So many businesses were seeking to staff up in 2021, right, as we were getting back to economic activities, and people were booking vacations, and there was all this pent-up demand to get back to travel and everything else that we hadn't been able to do during the pandemic. And that created a really intense environment in terms of competing for staff. And in 2021, in accommodation and food services, we saw wage growth rates over the year of just under 14%. That has started to slow down a bit. And again, looking across the tourism-related sectors, wage growth rates were pretty similar to the overall rate of 6.5% growth, just above that in accommodation and food services, arts, entertainment, and recreation, and about at that level in retail trade. All right. At the same time, with all of these opportunities that are being opened up, there's been a lot of focus on the way that workers are shifting, either shifting careers, shifting industries, changing jobs, and this has, the way I characterize it, has been a great labor reshuffling. This chart here shows the relationship between the growth in the state's economy and the rate at which workers leave their jobs. So there is a very close relationship when we see the rate at which the state's economy is growing in the red series, which shows the real growth in gross domestic product, that is the value of all the goods and services we produce in Maine. As that economic output is growing, there is an expanding set of opportunity for job seekers. And how do we see job seekers or workers react in that situation? Often they take advantage of those opportunities. So folks take advantage of opportunities for advancement, they switch careers, they switch industries, and often they go on to start their own businesses in a situation where we have expanding economic opportunities. And we've seen that in the last few years, where the rate at which workers are leaving their jobs for other opportunities has closely tracked with that rate of economic growth. And of course, the demographic picture in the state is playing a really important role here, because often workers that are reaching retirement ages are retiring with an incredible amount of experience, often retiring from leadership positions or management positions. And when that happens, often that creates an opportunity for someone else, either through internal promotion or job switching. But overwhelmingly, folks are leaving their jobs to take advantage of new opportunities, either increased compensation, better work-life balance, more flexibility, or to start their own businesses. So we have seen, during this period of labor reshuffling, we have seen the age structure in the tourism-related sectors in Maine shift as well. This chart here looks at the change in the share of jobs held in retail trade by age group. So we can see here that from 2019 to 2022, the age structure of job holders in the sector has shifted towards younger workers, those that are under 19, and towards those in the highest age group, those that are 65 and over. And we've seen a decrease in job holders that are in that 25 to 34 demographic. So this is, again, a really competitive environment for labor. Lots of folks are taking advantage of opportunities for advancement. And we see the workforce shifting away from some young workers, suggesting that workers in retail, and I'll show in leisure and hospitality in just a minute, workers in some of those demographic groups are shifting out of these sectors, taking advantage of other opportunities, and the workforce in these two sectors is shifting towards the demographic 65 and over and the very young demographic, often students that are either in high school or students that are in college and looking for either summer opportunities or some supplemental income while they're still in school. Oops. Sorry, I might have advanced too quickly through that one, but this is the picture of the shift in the age structure in leisure and hospitality, and then similar trends in retail. All right, I'm just going to do a quick. We looked at at the top line, the overall jobs levels, the overall state unemployment rate. Jobs are at record highs and unemployment is at record lows. That suggests a very a job market that is quite beneficial to job seekers. Lots of opportunities for job seekers out there. But we still see many groups, demographic groups and sub-state regions, where we see disparities in economic outcomes. And one group in particular, we see very significant disparities in terms of labor market opportunities, in particular for workers with disabilities. So it remains the case that despite this competition for workers and this expansion of economic opportunities, there are still many groups that have significant disadvantages. So according to the most recent data, if we look at the workforce by whether or not a job seeker has a disability or not, those with a disability are about 3 times more likely to be unemployed than those that don't identify as having a disability, and they're about half as likely to participate in the workforce. This period of intense competition is leading to gains for many groups that have historically faced barriers to employment in the workforce. So I think some of these gaps are shrinking, and we have some evidence to suggest that's the case, but there are still some pretty significant disparities in outcomes across different demographic groups and across different regions of the state. All right, so to summarize the way that some of these trends are affecting the workforce in the tourism-related sectors, we saw that younger age cohort is shrinking, and that is constraining the size of the workforce in the state overall. That leads to a lot of competition for workers. That's particularly a challenge for employers that have historically relied on a younger workforce. If you've relied on a younger workforce, that's a shrinking demographic over time. So I think that's a key challenge for employers in the tourism-related sectors, and that's largely driven by declining birth rates over many years. We have an increasingly smaller share of our population in those younger age groups. As well, there are, of course, fewer students if you rely on a seasonal workforce. There are fewer young people that might still be in school that might align well with seasonal job opportunities. So if you historically have relied on a younger workforce or sought to fill seasonal positions, there's increasing competition for a workforce that fits into those demographics. Layered on top of that has been a period of extremely robust economic growth. So not only are employers in the tourism-related sectors competing for workers, but employers in most sectors are competing for workers, right? So this is an overall an environment of intense competition, and that period of economic growth has led to a resurgence in travel as well, right? So think about all that pent-up demand in 2020, folks that maybe had to cancel a trip or weren't traveling because of the public health situation. And economic expansion puts more money in people's pockets. That means that they're much more likely to take advantage of an opportunity to visit the beautiful state of Maine. So in this time of intense competition for workers, we saw this explosion in demand for tourism in 2021 and 2022. And of course, another challenge is that in many of the most desirable areas in the state of Maine, affordable housing is a real challenge. So in many of the areas that folks want to visit, it's very challenging for a workforce to live near those areas because there is a real scarcity of affordable housing in many of those areas. So just to summarize some of those, that balance in the labor market between supply and demand of the labor, that balance really has flipped to where now there is an intense competition for workers. On average, in the first 15 years of the 2000s, there were about 2 unemployed job seekers for every 1 job opening. That's now flipped. There are 2 job openings now for every 1 unemployed job seeker. The state's unemployment rate has fallen from 5.7% down below 3% to 2.6% on average this year. And so that's an environment where, employers, I think, have to think differently and maybe adopt different strategies. That could include considering a broader pool of job seekers, reevaluating, what the requirements are for certain occupations to make it a more inclusive to a larger group of job seekers. Examine what you offer to job seekers, whether you offer, workforce development, examine what you offer in terms of compensation, upward mobility, mission, and, what is the mission of your organization and what kind of flexibility do you offer to job seekers? And as well, consider alternative ways that you might produce goods or services that rely less on labor. Are there ways that you can use technology to change the way that you deliver services or deliver goods to customers, given that there is such intense competition for labor? All right. With that, I'm not sure if we have any.
We have some time for Q&A. Connie's on this side of the room with a mic, and Megan is, on this side of the room with the mic. So if anybody has a question, you can just raise your hand and they'll bring you a mic.
Good morning. Thank you. That was a fabulous presentation on a slide that you had that showed that not all the jobs came back in hospitality, the green line. Was there any correlation between the numbers of hospitality businesses that shortened their hours of operation, days in business, because they couldn't find enough help, and so that is there. I know, and certainly where I live up near Bar Harbor, there are plenty of places that used to run 7 days a week, multiple shifts, but couldn't find enough people. Is there any relationship between that and what could be there?
Yeah, absolutely. So these data would be reflective of, active jobs that employers are reporting on their payroll. And so certainly I think, a lot of employers in leisure and hospitality have been trying to recruit and reach a staffing level, maybe reach a similar staffing level to what they had in 2019, or just overall increase their staffing level, but there just aren't enough candidates to fill those positions. So I think it's reflective both of positions that are going unfilled because there aren't enough candidates to fill the position, and employers that have adopted different strategies as you laid out. So either, if you are not able to reach your staffing level to operate 7 days a week, how do you reallocate to maximize profits given, you might only have enough staff to operate for 5 days a week, or however employers are changing their strategies in response to that. So certainly there's a combination of, in terms of not reaching that staffing level overall being about 5% lower. I think it's a combination of trying to recruit, but maybe there isn't quite that need. Perhaps some businesses closed down permanently as a result of the pandemic. So if a restaurant or hotel closed down permanently, that could explain some of it. And employers adopting new strategies in terms of focusing on specific days of the week, or maybe going from 3 meal services to 2 meal services, et cetera. Absolutely.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. You had one slide that showed the increase in wages. Was that due to just like low unemployment rates and people, to retain and hire new employees? Or how did the stimulus dollars affect that? That access to capital is pretty prevalent at that time, and I think it afforded some industries the ability to perhaps pay a higher wage rate. Do you see that staying or shifting in another direction?
Absolutely. So I think that there are a couple of things that explain that surge in wages. So I'll go back to this chart here. So what happened in 2020 is when we look at average wages, particularly in leisure and hospitality and retail trade, for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was actually the case that a lot of the job losses in those industries were concentrated in low-wage jobs. So, for example, a frontline staff might have been more likely to lose their job relative to a manager or somebody in leadership, for example. That had the effect of driving wages up. At the same time, there were relief packages and stimulus packages, including the Paycheck Protection Program, right, which created an infusion of stimulus towards wages. Those two things combined, right, had the effect of driving wages up pretty significantly in 2020 compared to 2019. Now, many of those stimulus programs, advancing a year or two into the future, right, many of those stimulus programs have since ended, right, but to compete in the current labor market, right, you have to offer a higher prevailing wage rate. So I think in terms of looking at, in particular, the wage growth from 2022 over 2021, I think that is explained much less by the effect of the pandemic or stimulus programs, but just the overall competitive hiring environment that's driving wages upward. Just like any other scarcity that would affect anything else, scarcity does drive prices up.
I don't know if I need the mic or not, but
thanks for sharing all this. This is great. I was wondering if you have seen any trends in people's desired employment statuses, specifically more recently from maybe instead of preferring full-time, going part-time, and if that's changed based in the age categories in a different way than we've seen in the past.
Overall, there is a similar mix of the state's overall workforce. There is a similar mix of folks that are working part-time and folks that are working full-time. That hasn't changed too much compared to, going back to 2016, 17, 18, that kind of time range. Certainly. I do think that flexibility is something that's important to lots of job seekers, and that could take different forms, whether it's the flexibility to work different shifts, or the flexibility to occasionally work remotely, could be the flexibility to work part-time. But again, I think the competition in the labor market means that workers have more bargaining power. They have more options. They have more alternatives. So if you're a job seeker and that's really important to you, whether it's working part-time or having a more flexible work arrangement in some way, right, that could accommodate your needs as a care provider, for example, or any other needs. There are lots of opportunities for job seekers. And so I think folks are taking advantage of that and seeking opportunities that align with what's most important to them, right? For some, it might be compensation might be the most important thing to me, but that's not true for all job seekers. For some, certainly flexibility and maybe a part-time work arrangement might be exactly what they need. But overall, it's a similar balance of part-time and full-time work to what it's long been.
Mark, thank you for your presentation. It's kind of a macro presentation. On the micro side, you have a situation where the job seekers aren't necessarily matching the job openings. You're losing higher level people, trying to replace them with less mature workforce. So they can't necessarily do those jobs. So on the micro side, it might even be worse. On the macro side, you're just looking for a body to replace a body. Job openings, job seekers. But on the micro side, if you got somebody 18 going in the workforce, it's not like they can go in and be an assistant GM at a hotel group.
Absolutely, yeah. What we're looking at, at the macro level, like the total jobs in the state's leisure and hospitality sector is very much macro. It doesn't tell you about the distribution of occupations, whether somebody is working in an entry-level position or they're a high-skilled, somebody who's working in a managerial or leadership position. It doesn't tell you about the number of years of experience of those folks in that particular sector or the skills that they developed in that sector. Certainly, I agree. And this chart, I think, speaks to that, right? We have seen a workforce that has shifted, in particular to that young, under 19 demographic. And certainly that's a challenge, right? Because there is a lot of competition, for those workers in those, prime age groups, 25 to 34 and 35 to 44. There are a lot of opportunities for those folks in other sectors, right? And I think they're taking advantage of that. And that's a real challenge, certainly, because of the experience, the skills, and the types of tasks that a more experienced workforce can bring to an organization that a younger workforce can't. Absolutely.
Thank you, Mark. Every time I hear you, I'm taking notes and learning something new, so thank you. You mentioned the 88% of folks who migrated into the state of Maine from other states. Is there more contextual data breaking that down? Like, who is that, of that group, who is 55 plus, who's in the prime working ages, who's the younger generation? I was just curious if you had, because that's a question I always get, where are the people? And what I remind them is we've had in-migration, I think we're fourth in the nation for in-migration at one point. But who are those people?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's still some things that we don't know. There are some ongoing research projects that that I'm a part of. So hopefully, more to come. Hopefully, we'll have more of a clear picture. I think in general, what I would say is that the folks, particularly folks that have relocated from other states into Maine, on average, that's a younger demographic compared to the state population as a whole. On average, it's a higher income demographic compared to the state as a whole, and one that comes with a higher educational attainment or specialized skill level. In particular, I think some of the attributes that have brought folks to Maine has been, again, I think remote work has been a huge part of it. So folks that are coming from particularly higher cost metro areas in the Northeast, relocating to Maine because they have that increased flexibility with remote work. So coming into an area that by comparison is much more affordable, a much more affordable housing market. But of course, that's increasing competition in the local housing market. So I think on average, yes, a younger demographic, more families that have young children, high education, high income, high skill, absolutely, on average. Yep.
Time for one more. Anybody else has the last one?
Mark, I guess a follow-up to that would be, projecting that out forward, assuming those people stay in Maine, what can we look forward to over the next decade or so? Do you have any prognostication?
That's a great question, and I think if you looked at the first picture I showed you, where not only did we recover all of the jobs that were lost early on in the pandemic, but we actually reached new levels of economic activity, new record high job levels. I think that was closely tied to the population growth, because the demographics of the population that were here, right at the beginning of the pandemic, were such that there were more people that were aging out of the workforce than the folks that were aging into the workforce, right? That was going to put overall constraint, somewhat downward pressure on the available workforce and total jobs. But that large influx of migrants, folks mostly moving from other states in 2021 and 2022, that had somewhat of a balancing effect, right? Balancing out and actually leading to more job growth relative to the demographics and the aging that were somewhat constraining the workforce and job growth. So I think overall, without that migration, probably the jobs recovery wouldn't have been as robust as it was. But a key question, of course, is will that continue, right? I think that there are lots of attributes that are about the state of Maine that many people are looking for. The quality of life, the recreational opportunities, the incredible outdoor amenities that Maine has to offer. The quality of life here is exceptional. But a really important constraint is the available housing stock. So I think if you talk to employers that are trying to actively recruit folks from other states, that's something that they cite often as, sure, I have somebody that has the skills I need, they want to be here, but they can't find an affordable house. So I think that there will be some big questions that the housing market might constrain additional population growth, but I think that there are and continue to be a lot of attributes that people are seeking that Maine has to offer.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Thanks.